Sweetheart of the Song Tra Bong. Vietnam was full of strange stories, some improbable, some well beyond that. But the stories that will last forever are those that stroll back and forth across the border between trivia and bedlam, the mad and the mundane. This one keeps returning to me. I heard it from Rat Kiley, who swore up and down to its truth, although in the end, I'll admit, that doesn't amount to much of a warranty. Among the men in Alpha Company, Rat had a reputation for exaggeration and overstatement, a compulsion to rev up the facts, and for most of us it was normal procedure to discount 60 or 70% of anything he had to say. If Rat told you, for example, that he'd slept with 4 girls in one night, you could figure it was about a girl and a half. It wasn't a question of deceit, just the opposite. He wanted to heat up the truth, to make it burn so hot that you would feel exactly what he felt. For Rat Kiley, I think, facts were formed by sensation, not the other way around. And when you listened to one of his stories, you'd find yourself performing rapid calculations in your head, subtracting superlatives, figuring the square root of an absolute, and then multiplying by maybe. Still, with this particular story, Rat never backed down. He claimed to have witnessed the incident with his own eyes, and I remember how upset he became one morning when Mitchell Sanders challenged him on its basic premise. "It can't happen," Sanders said. "Nobody ships his honey over to Na. It doesn't ring true. I mean, you just can't import your own personal poontang." Rat shook his head. "I saw it, man. I was right there. This guy did it." "His girlfriend?" "Straight on. It's a fact." Rat's voice squealed a little. He paused and looked at his hands. "Listen, the guy sends her the money. He flies her over, this cute blonde, just a kid, just barely out of high school. She shows up with a suitcase and one of those plastic cosmetic bags. Comes right out to the boonies. I swear to God, man, she's got on culottes. White culottes and the sexy pink sweater. There she is." He looked over at me for a second, not quite grinning, not saying a word, but I could read the amusement in his eyes. Rat saw it too. "No lie," he muttered. "Culottes." When he arrived in country, before joining Alpha Company, Rat had been assigned to a small medical detachment up in the mountains west of Chu Lai, near the village of Tra Bong, where along with 8 other enlisted men, he ran an aid station that provided basic emergency and trauma care. Casualties were flown in by helicopter, stabilized, and shipped out to hospitals in Chu Lai or Da Nang. It was great work, Rat said, but predictable. Amputations, mostly legs and feet. The area was heavily mined, thick with bouncing betties and homemade booby traps. For a medic, though, it was an ideal duty, and Rat counted himself lucky. There was plenty of cold beer, 3 hot meals a day, a tin roof over his head. No humping at all. No officers either. You could let your hair grow, he said, and you didn't have to polish your boots or snap off salutes or put up with the usual rear Eclean nonsense. The highest-ranking NCO was an E6 named Eddie Diamond, whose pleasures ran from dope to Darwin, and except for a rare field inspection, there is no such thing as military discipline. As Rat described it, the compound was situated at the top of a flat-crested hill along the northern outskirts of Tra Bong. At one end was a small dirt helipad. At the other end, in a rough semicircle, the mess hall and medical hooches overlooked a river called the Song Tra Bong. Surrounding the place were tangled rolls of concertina wire, with bunkers and reinforced firing positions at staggered intervals, and base security was provided by a mixed unit of RFs, PFs, and basics and ARVN infantry, which is to say virtually no security at all. As soldiers, the ARVNs were useless. The rough and puffs were outright dangerous, and yet even with decent troops, the place was clearly indefensible. To the north and west, the country rose up in thick walls of wilderness, triple canopied jungle, mountains unfolding into higher mountains, ravines and gorges and fast-moving rivers and waterfalls and exotic butterflies and steep cliffs and smoky little hamlets and great valleys of bamboo and elephant grass. Originally, in the early 1960s, the place had been set up as a special forces outpost, and when Rat Kiley arrived nearly a decade later, a squad of 6 Green Berets still used the compound as a base of operations. The Greenies were not social animals, Rat said, but far from social. They had their own hooch at the edge of the perimeter, fortified with sandbags and a metal fence, and except for the bare essentials they avoided contact with the medical detachment. Secretive and suspicious, loners by nature, the 6 Greenies would sometimes vanish for days at a time or even weeks. Then late in the night they would just as magically reappear, moving like shadows through the moonlight, filing in silently from the dense rainforest off to the west. Among the medics were jokes about this, but no one asked questions. While the outpost was isolated and vulnerable, Rat said, he always felt a curious sense of safety there. Nothing much ever happened. The place was never mortared, never taken under fire, and the war seemed to be somewhere far away. On occasion, when casualties came in, there was quick spurts of activity, but otherwise the days flowed by without incident, a smooth and peaceful time. Most mornings were spent on the volleyball court. In the heat of midday, the men would head for the shade, lazing away the long afternoons, and after sundown there were movies and card games and sometimes all-night drinking sessions. It was during one of those late nights that Eddie Diamond first brought up the tantalizing possibility. It was an offhand comment, a joke, really. What they should do, Eddie said, was pull some bucks and bring in a few moccasins from Saigon, spice things up. And after a moment, one of the men laughed and said, our own little EM club. And somebody else said, hey, yeah, we pay our fucking dues, don't we? It was nothing serious, just passing time, playing with the possibilities. And so for a while they tossed the idea around, how you could actually get away with it, no officers or anything, nobody to clamp down. Then they dropped the subject and moved on to cars and baseball. Later in the night, though, a young medic named Mark Fossey kept coming back to the subject. Look, if you think about it, he said, it's not that crazy. You could actually do it. Do what? Rat said. You know, bring a girl. I mean, what's the problem? Rat shrugged. Nothing. A war. Well, see, that's the thing, Mark Fossey said. No war here. You could really do it. A pair of solid brass bowls, that's all you need. There was some laughter, and Eddie Diamond told him he'd best shut down his dick, but Fossey just frowned and looked at the ceiling for a while, and then went off to write a letter. 6 weeks later, his girlfriend showed up. The way Rat told it, she came in by helicopter along with the daily resupply shipment out of Chu Lai, a tall, big-boned blonde. At best, Rat said, she was 17 years old, fresh out of Cleveland Heights Senior High. She had long white legs and blue eyes and a complexion like strawberry ice cream. Very friendly, too. At the helipad that morning, Mark Fossey grinned and put his arm around her and said, guys, this is Marianne. The girl seemed tired and somewhat lost, but she smiled. There was a heavy silence. Eddie Diamond, the ranking NCO, made a small motion with his hand, and some of the others murmured a word or two. Then they watched Mark Fossey pick up her suitcase and lead her by the arm down to the hooches. For a long while the men were quiet. That fucker, somebody finally said. At evening chow, Mark Fossey explained how he'd set it up. It was expensive, he admitted, and the logistics were complicated, but it wasn't like going to the moon. Cleveland to Los Angeles, LA to Bangkok, Bangkok to Saigon. She hopped the C-130 up to Chu Lai and stayed overnight at the USO and the next morning home to ride west with the resupplied chopper. A cinch, Fossey said, and gazed down at his pretty girlfriend. Thing is, you got to want it enough. Mary Ann Bell and Mark Fossey had been sweethearts since grammar school. From the 6th grade on, they had known for a fact that someday they would be married and live in a fine gingerbread house near Lake Erie and have three healthy yellow-haired children and grow old together, and no doubt die in each other's arms and be buried in the same walnut casket. That was the plan. They were very much in love, full of dreams, and in the ordinary flow of their lives, the whole scenario might well have come true. On the first night they set up house in one of the bunkers along the perimeter, near the special fortress Hooch, and over the next 2 weeks they stuck together like a pair of high school On the first night they set up house in one of the bunkers along the perimeter, near the special forces Hooch, and over the next 2 weeks they stuck together like a pair of high school studies. It was almost disgusting, Rat said, the way they mooned over each other, always holding hands, always laughing over some private joke. All they needed, he said, were a couple of matching sweaters. But among the medics there was some envy. It was Vietnam, after all, and Mary Ann Bell was an attractive girl. Too wide in the shoulders, maybe, but she had terrific legs, bubbly, a bubbly personality, a happy smile. The men generally liked her. Out on the volleyball court she wore cut-off blue jeans and a black swimsuit top, which the guys appreciated, and in the evening she liked to dance to music from Rat's portable tape deck. There was a novelty to it. She was good for morale. At times she gave off a kind of come-get-me energy, coy and flirtatious, but apparently it never bothered Mark Farsi. In fact, he seemed to enjoy it, just grinning at her, because he was so much in love, and because it was the sort of show that a girl will sometimes put on for her boyfriend's entertainment and education. Though she was young, Rat said, Mary Ann Bell was no timid child. She was curious about things. During her first days in country, she liked to roam around the compound asking questions. What exactly was a trip flare? How did a claymore work? What was behind those scary green mountains to the west? Then she'd squint and listen quietly while somebody filled her in. She had a good, quick mind. She paid attention. Often, especially during the hot afternoons, she would spend time with the ARVNs out along the perimeter, picking up little phrases of Vietnamese, learning how to cook rice over a can of sterno, how to eat with her hands. The guys sometimes liked to kid her about it. Our own little nut. The guys sometimes liked to kid her about it. Our own little native, they'd say. But Mary Ann would just smile and stick out her tongue. I'm here, she'd say. I might as well learn something. The war intrigued her. The land, too. And the mystery, the war intrigued her. The land, too. And the mystery. At the beginning of her second week, she began pestering Mark Fossey to take her down to the village at the foot of the hill. In a quiet voice, very patiently, he tried to tell her that it was a bad idea, way too dangerous. But Mary Ann kept after him. She wanted to get a feel for how people lived, what the smells and customs were. It did not impress her that the VC owned the place. Listen, it can't be that bad, she said. They're human beings, aren't they, like everybody else? Fossey nodded. He loved her. And so in the morning, Rat Kiley and 2 other medics tagged along as security while Mark and Mary Ann strolled through the ville like a pair of tourists. If the girl was nervous, she didn't show it. She seemed comfortable and entirely at home. The hostile atmosphere did not seem to register. All morning Mary Ann chatted away about how quaint the place was, how she loved the thatched roofs and naked children and wonderful simplicity of village life. A strange thing to watch, Rat said. The 17-year-old doll, in her golden culottes, perky and fresh-faced like a cheerleader visiting the opposing team's locker room. Her pretty blue eyes seemed to glow. She couldn't get enough of it. On their way back up to the compound, they stopped for a swim in the Song Tra Bong.